Imagine you are a young woman in a Lakota village, somewhere on the Great Plains, 200 years ago. Your husband comes home one evening and tells you something. He wants to take a second wife. His younger sister, recently widowed, has 2 small children, and no one to provide for her. Without a husband, without a provider, without the protection of a household, her options are almost non-existent. She and her children will struggle. Maybe they will not survive the next winter. And here is the part that surprises most people. You agree. Not because you are forced to, not because you have no choice, but because in your world, in your community, with your understanding of how survival actually works, this decision makes complete sense. No drama, no betrayal, no devastation. Just a practical, deliberate expansion of a household that now has more resources, more labor, more protection, and 2 children who will not starve. For most of human history, across dozens of Native American tribes, this was not a scandal. It was not a secret. It was not even particularly unusual. So why did it happen? Why did so many Native American men have multiple wives, and why did women so often agree to it, sometimes even request it? The answer has almost nothing to do with what modern culture assumes, and everything to do with survival, economics, and a social structure built entirely around keeping people alive. Before anything else, we need to clear away the most common misconception. Because when most people hear multiple wives, their mind immediately goes to one place: power, control, men taking what they wanted from women who had no say. In some cultures, throughout some periods of history, that picture is accurate. But applying it automatically to Native American polygamy is not just inaccurate. It fundamentally misunderstands how these societies actually worked. In many of the tribes where multiple marriages were practiced, including numerous Plains tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot, as well as many other nations across North America, women held significant social standing. They owned the household. They owned the teepee. In many documented cases, if a marriage ended, it was the man who left, not the woman, because the home and its contents belonged to her. This is not the social structure of a society built around male domination of women. This is something more complicated, more practical, and more interesting. Multiple marriage, in most documented Native American contexts, was not primarily about desire. It was about economics. It was about labor. It was about survival mathematics, in a world where the margin between enough and not enough was dangerously thin. And once you understand that, everything else falls into place. Here is the practical reality that shaped everything. A successful buffalo hunt on the Great Plains did not produce a small, manageable amount of meat. It produced an overwhelming, time-sensitive abundance. A single buffalo could yield hundreds of pounds of meat, hide, bone, sinew, fat, and organ material, all of which had to be processed, preserved, and prepared before it spoiled, often within days. Processing a full buffalo was an enormous amount of physical work. The hide alone required hours of scraping, soaking, and tanning. The meat had to be sliced thin and dried or smoked for preservation. Fat had to be rendered. Sinew had to be stripped and prepared for use in clothing and tools. Bones had to be cracked and boiled for marrow. One woman could not do all of this alone before the meat began to spoil. 2 women could. 3 women working together could process a large hunt completely, with nothing wasted. In a world where wasted food in winter meant starvation, and where a single buffalo hide could mean the difference between a family staying warm or freezing, the labor capacity of a household was not a comfort consideration. It was a survival calculation. A man with 2 wives did not just have more companionship. He had a household with twice the processing capacity, twice the clothing production, twice the food preservation capability. In practical terms, a larger household with more women working together was a more resilient, more productive, better-equipped survival unit than a smaller one. This is why, in many documented tribal accounts, it was sometimes the first wife who suggested or even requested a second wife, particularly her own sister, a practice anthropologists call sororal polygyny. A sister was a known quantity, a trusted person, someone whose presence in the household strengthened it rather than creating conflict. There is another layer to this story that almost never gets discussed, and it is the one that most directly explains why multiple marriage became not just accepted but sometimes socially necessary in many Plains tribes. War and hunting killed men, constantly, and in significant numbers. Intertribal conflict, hunting accidents, disease, and the general brutality of life on the frontier meant that in many Plains communities, women significantly outnumbered men of marriageable age. This was not a small imbalance. In some documented communities following periods of significant conflict or disease, the ratio was dramatic. In a society with no welfare system, no government support, no social safety net of any kind, a woman without a husband and without an extended family structure to absorb her was genuinely vulnerable. She could not easily hunt large game alone. She could not defend her household against raids alone. Her children's survival depended on being part of a functioning household with access to resources and protection. For a man with established resources, good hunting skills, a solid household, reliable winter food stores, taking a widowed woman and her children into his household was not purely an act of generosity. It was a community responsibility, understood and respected as such, and in many tribes it was socially expected of men who had the means to do it. The widow was not a burden in this arrangement. She was a contributing member of a larger household, bringing her own labor, skills, and often her children, who would eventually become contributing members of the community themselves. This system, imperfect, complicated, and shaped by circumstances most modern people never have to face, kept people alive who would otherwise have had almost no viable options. Here is the question that matters most, and the one that gets asked least. What did the women themselves think about this? The historical record on this is more complex than most people expect. It was not uniformly positive. Jealousy, conflict between co-wives, and genuine unhappiness in some arrangements are documented in oral histories and early ethnographic accounts. These were human relationships, with all the complexity that implies. But the picture is also not uniformly negative, far from it. Among the Lakota, oral histories recorded by ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries include accounts of women describing the practical advantages of shared households openly and without apparent resentment. More hands for work, more companionship during the long, isolated winters, someone to share the burden of childcare during illness or difficult seasons. Among some tribes, women held direct influence over who entered the household as a second wife. A first wife whose husband wished to remarry could accept or reject the proposed match based on her own assessment of whether the new woman would be a good household partner. This was not universal. Practices varied enormously across different nations, but it existed, and it significantly complicates the simple narrative of passive female victims. There are also documented cases of women leaving marriages they were unhappy in. Divorce in many Native American tribes was not the legally complex, socially catastrophic event it was in many other cultures during the same period. A woman who wished to end a marriage in a number of plains and woodland tribes could do so, and did. The reality, as with almost every aspect of Native American life, was not simple. It was human. Here is the part of the story that explains why most people know almost nothing accurate about this topic. When European missionaries, traders, and colonists encountered Native American multiple marriage practices, they did not study them with curiosity. They condemned them immediately, through a specific cultural and religious lens that had no room for understanding the survival logic underneath.
Missionaries actively worked to end polygamous marriages in tribes they had contact with, sometimes forcing men to choose one wife and abandon others, leaving widows and their children without household support, in a world where that support was essential to survival. The irony is documented in the historical record. Missionaries who forced the dissolution of multiple wife households sometimes created the very poverty and vulnerability they claimed to be saving people from, because the economic and social logic of those arrangements was completely invisible to outsiders who could only see the surface. Understanding this history matters, not because multiple marriage should be uncritically celebrated, but because judging it through a purely modern Western lens, without understanding the survival context that created it, produces a picture that is not just incomplete. It is wrong.
So why did Native American men have multiple wives? Not primarily because of desire, not because women had no power or choice, but because the world they lived in created specific, real, practical pressures, labor demands, widow vulnerability, unbalanced gender ratios after conflict, that multiple household arrangements addressed directly and effectively. It was a social system, built by people who understood their environment completely, shaped over generations of trial and error, calibrated to keep the maximum number of people alive in conditions that had no mercy for inefficiency. Was it perfect? No. Were there unhappy marriages, jealousy, and conflict? Absolutely. Because these were human beings, not a historical exhibit. But dismissing it as simple domination or reducing it to a curiosity misses the real story entirely. The real story is about people solving impossible problems with the tools available to them, and building a social structure that, for all its complications, kept communities alive through centuries of brutal winters, constant conflict, and a world that offered very little margin for error. If this changed how you think about Native American history, let me know in the comments. And subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories behind how these communities actually lived.